If you believe repealing and replacing Obamacare is a good idea, this is your best and only chance to make it happen, because everything else has failed except this approach, which will work if we get behind it. If you want a single-payer health care system, this is your worst nightmare. Bernie, this ends your dream of a single-payer health care system for America.
Even as Senator Bernie Sanders pitches his Medicare for All plan, Senate Republicans are making a last-ditch effort to repeal Obamacare again. And look sharp, they are getting really close to having the votes to pass it. Here to discuss, Jonathan Cohn of the Huffington Post, Forbes opinion editor Avik Roy, and former Vermont Governor Howard Dean. Thank you all for being here. Let me start with you, Governor Dean, because now you have this sort of dichotomy that's happening. We just heard Lindsay Graham, who's got this plan that would essentially eviscerate Medicaid and repeal the Affordable Care Act, and he's presenting that as either take this or you're going to wind up with Medicare for all, with universal health care. Do you think that that kind of a threat has the risk of scaring enough Republicans over the line that the whole outcome of this week, when it was supposed to be about universal health care, will be the repeal of Obamacare?
Well, first of all, this is a ridiculous bill. It jacks up premiums on people with pre-existing conditions, which is to say it eliminates them. This bill was put together by people who know very little about health care, and the only guy that does, Dr. Cassidy, is screwing his own state to the tune of $2 billion. So this is a ridiculous bill. It's a political bill, most likely to help Lindsey Graham's good friend John McCain redeem himself in the eyes of the right-wing Republicans, which is always a mistake. So this is nonsense. As far as Bernie's bill goes, there's going to be a lot of work to do. I mean, it hasn't been scored. There's a lot of questions, but it is an incredibly important moment in the history of American health care. Universal health care for all Americans is now something that's supported by about 60% of Americans. The phrase Medicare for all is supported by about 60% of Americans. So I think this is an important moment in health care. We do have to kill Graham's bill. He's up against it because he's got to get the whole thing done by September 30th through the House and the Senate. But it is a real threat because it would really hurt Americans just as badly as Trump Care did.
Yeah, I want to come back to the politics of the Sanders bill in just a second, but I want to first go to Avik Roy specifically on this Graham-Cassidy bill, because, you know, though people have looked at it, have sort of run through what it would do. It essentially repeals all the subsidies that people are currently getting to help them buy insurance in the individual market. It ends the Medicaid expansion. It has these vast transfers of spending with block grants that will extract money from big blue states like New York and give it to red states who didn't expand Medicaid. It would overall cut Medicaid. It would eliminate the exchanges on the individual market, and it would allow insurance companies to charge higher premiums for people with pre-existing conditions, essentially going back to the status quo where insurance companies could gouge you if you had a pre-existing condition. I don't really understand the politics of Republicans wanting to do that, Avik. Do you?
You know, it's funny. You played the clip of Lindsey Graham saying that this would end Bernie Sanders' dream of single payer in America. Actually, the opposite is true, because you could take these block grants. It amounts to about $200 billion a year of federal spending that would be given to states to subsidize the uninsured, which is comparable to what Obamacare spends or will spend in the future.
No, it's less. It's considerably less.
But they can use it, instead of using it for tax credits to buy private insurance like Obamacare does. If you were California, New York, or Vermont, you could take those dollars and expand single-payer health care. So this plan actually expands the ability of states to enact single-payer in their states. And it doesn't do a whole lot to actually give states the countervailing option to have a more market-oriented system. So in that way, this plan actually is something that I think is going to be fairly controversial in conservative circles.
Jonathan Cohn, your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think Avik and I are looking at the same piece of paper or summary. Maybe he knows more than I do about what's in this plan. Joy, you said earlier that it means less money to the states. That's absolutely right. I mean, with any of these repeal bills, you want to watch the dollars, what's happening. This reduces the money overall going to states, and then in 10 years, actually, the money cuts off altogether, and apparently, well, Congress could then start to reappropriate it again. If you're putting less money into the system, you're going to take health insurance away from people.
Yeah.
If you give states more, leeway to give them the right to take away protections for people with pre-existing conditions, some of the states are going to do that, and it's going to be, this is going to be fewer people covered, fewer protections. It does not move you closer to universal coverage. It clearly moves you against. And it looks a lot like the bills we've seen before.
Yeah, it does. And given that, and given the threat to so many people's health care, Governor Dean, when you have Medicaid on the line, when Republicans have made it very clear they're not giving up on this idea of ending the Medicaid expansion, which means tens of millions of people would just lose access to health care, period. Why then are Democrats making this wholesale pivot to talk about a universal health care bill that even our own genius, in-house genius, Ali Velshi said has zero chance of passing, and that we don't know exactly what the tax increases would be, but that Republicans are going to run on as a huge tax increase? We know that that's what they're going to do. We can put up a cut two here. Bernie Sanders has estimated it would be $1.4 trillion per year, how much it would cost. The Urban Institute estimates it's $2.5 trillion per year. Republicans would simply run on that as Democrats passing a multi-trillion-dollar tax cut. Is this the time to be making that rhetorical shift for the party?
It is, but look, the bill, when it passes, and it is going to pass someday, I agree it's certainly not going to pass in the immediate foreseeable future, is going to look very different, like the one that was dropped by Bernie and the other 15 senators, many of whom are thinking of running for president. So, I mean, this is a collective political acumen of people who actually know something about how to do politics, and their calculation is that the American people eventually will buy Medicare for all, and I think they will. But I agree, it's not going to happen soon. It's going to look very different than the bill that was dropped this week, but it's an incredibly big milestone, because it means in the Democratic Party, people finally have the courage to actually do something about making our health care system comprehensive and cover everybody like all the other democracies in the world.
And Avik, as a member of the ideological faction that will be presenting this as a giant tax cut, let me ask you if this would persuade people on your side of the ideological aisle. If the argument had been made, look, if you take health care off the books of American companies, if they're not footing the bill for their employees' health care, they could actually be more productive. They could spend that money on productivity, on hiring more people, on hiring, more staff, on paying their people better, or just on R&D. Is that a persuasive argument to conservatives to say, you know what, maybe we should go to the system that the vast majority of the Western world uses and not have employers providing health care to 250 million people?
Well, listen, Joe, I've written about this a lot. If you actually had a real single-payer system like Canada's, where everyone had government-run insurance, but the government also heavily regulated the price of hospital care, prescription pharmaceuticals and the like, restricted access to costly care, then yes, you could have a system that spends less money than the system we have. But Bernie's plan doesn't do that. Bernie's plan is all carrots and no sticks. It would increase federal spending over a 10-year period, according to government data, by $28 trillion. Trillion with a T. That's 55% increase of federal spending relative to today. And that's because the system we have today has a lot of state and local and private spending that you'd then be transferring to the federal government. So it's totally unworkable when Howard Dean said, well, we'll have to wait for the CBO score. That's a polite way of saying the numbers don't add up. And look, that's not to say single-payer plans can't work in theory, but taking the system we have in America and moving it to single-payer is a hell of a lot harder than even repealing Obamacare.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I think to the point that Avik is making, how do you address this question? If you say to people, you're going to pay higher taxes, but you can have unlimited health care. You can have as much health care as you need or want, and there's no government restriction on how much you can use. Don't the costs end up then ballooning because people then just use more of it? They use more of these services.
Yeah, I mean, look, the way universal healthcare systems work abroad is they do give people more generous coverage in general than you get in the United States. And whether it's a single-payer system where the government's giving everyone coverage, or a hybrid system where people are using like these, independent nonprofits, the government then, as Avik says, they regulate the prices. They basically dictate the prices to the providers, to the hospitals, to the drug makers. You can do that, and it works. I'll tell you, the results in those countries are very good. But, there are trade-offs in every system, and getting there, as Avik says, is actually actually a lot harder than saying it will work eventually. How do you do that transition? But, you know, this is the beginning of a conversation, not an end, hopefully.
All right. Well, it's the beginning of two, whether or not we're going to scrap the Affordable Care Act and whether or not we're going to move to single payer. Great conversation, guys. Thank you very much, Jonathan Cohn and Avik Roy. Howard Dean will be back in our next hour. All right, guys. Thank you.